Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to mourn the untimely demise of intellectual integrity, a tragedy that unfolded before our very eyes during the latest installment of Episode 441 of the Jordan Peterson podcast. Joined by guests Bruce Pardee and Konstantin Kizin, what should have been a penetrating and incisive discussion of the paramount importance of free speech and the perils of government overreach instead metastasized into a grotesque spectacle of self-congratulatory, navel-gazing, vapid verbosity, and a relentless onslaught of logical fallacies that would make even the most unabashed intellectual fraud recoil in horror. Where to begin with this slovenly mess disguised as discourse? Perhaps we should start with the slippery slope arguments peppered throughout like so many rancid croutons in a word salad. Peterson warns ominously that Bill C-63 allowing for pre-crime solutions is not a brand new idea, and that there are already provisions in the code that allow for pre-crime solutions before a crime happens. The insidious implication is that this bill is just the thin edge of the wedge, the first step down the road to a full-blown Minority Report-style thought police dystopia. But this lazy fear-mongering ignores the crucial distinctions and safeguards in the actual legislation. As Pardee himself notes, the current provisions are narrow, requiring credible evidence of imminent harm. C-63 may be a misguided overcorrection, but it is a far cry from the Orwellian nightmare Peterson conjures. Nuance, as ever, escapes Peterson's Manichaean mind. But why grapple with the complexities of reality when you can simply knock down straw men? Peterson puts words in Trudeau's mouth, claiming he has said he believes in free speech, before snarkily noting that even the Chinese constitution guarantees free speech. The implication is that such pronouncements are meaningless, that Trudeau is a hypocrite on par with the Chi-Coms. But this glib comparison papers over the vast chasm between Canada's robust free speech protections and China's ruthless censorship. Has Trudeau thrown any journalists in gulags lately? Must have missed that press release. Peterson's cheap rhetorical point requires him to pretend that all affirmations of free speech are created equal, that there is no meaningful difference between an embattled democracy trying to balance competing rights and a one-party police state. Intellectual honesty, thy name is not Peterson. Of course, constructing flimsy straw men is par for the course for Peterson, who has yet to meet a complex issue he couldn't reduce to a simplistic binary. He presents the tired false dichotomy of the conservatives who portray themselves as virtue people, who put virtue before freedom, versus the implied free-thinking liberals. Never mind that principled conservatives have been some of the fiercest defenders of civil liberties, or that the progressive left often constrains freedom in the name of virtue. Peterson needs his good guys and bad guys, his white hats and black hats. Let facts be damned. Facts are in short supply as Peterson launches into an ad hominem attack on his own guest. He just can't resist needling Pardee, recalling the problem he had with him, namely that Pardee committed the cardinal sin of being suspiciously reasonable rather than conforming to Peterson's caricature of a right-wing crackpot. God forbid someone complicate Peterson's tidy narrative by failing to fit into his neat ideological boxes. The sheer arrogance of assuming anyone who disagrees with you must be unhinged is staggering. But humility has never been Peterson's strong suit. No, Peterson much prefers to cloak his assertions in the veneer of authority, a tactic on full display as he name-drops Cardinal Newman and invokes the long line of theological speculation to lend his argument the imprimatur of deep wisdom. But as with so much of Peterson's grandiloquence, scratch the surface and you'll find little of substance. Citing Cardinal Newman's defense of the idea of God as if it was some knockdown argument is the height of intellectual laziness. Newman's theology, while undoubtedly influential, is hardly unassailable. Plenty of philosophers, both before and since, have poked holes in his reasoning. But why engage with that debate when you can simply use Newman as a rhetorical cudgel? Peterson's disregard for rigor rears its head again as he makes a hasty generalization about the scale of harm caused by gender-affirming care. Based on his own personal impression that the first sex change operation was a dubious enterprise, he leaps to the hyperbolic conclusion that the cascading consequence has been the worst medical malpractice in maybe ever. Really? Worse than lobotomies, thalidomide, Tuskegee? Even if you share Peterson's misgivings about gender-affirming care, to call it the worst malpractice ever is an absurd exaggeration that only serves to reveal his lack of perspective. But wild overstatement is Peterson's stock in trade. When he's not making sweeping, unsubstantiated claims, Peterson is veering off into red herring irrelevancies, like his bizarre tangent about law professor Claudine Gay. What does the elevation of an allegedly woke academic to university president have to do with the crumbling rule of law? Peterson never makes the connection clear, but he smugly proclaims Gay is emblematic of the universities that's right, and in the same way that she was emblematic of the universities, this is becoming emblematic of the law. This is pure sophistry, using loose associative reasoning to create the impression of a point without actually making one. It's a verbal sleight of hand to distract from the lack of any real argumentative substance. That substance is sorely missed as Peterson retreats into obscurantism with gems like, if you can see a problem that's your problem like, and you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is something like, well, it bothers you. Come again. This barely rises above the level of dorm room stoner babble. It's the kind of vapid deepity that sounds profound but collapses into incoherence upon the slightest scrutiny. What does it mean for a problem to be your problem because it bothers you? By that logic, are all our irritations now our personal responsibilities? If potholes bother me, am I now tasked with fixing the roads? This is the kind of muddled thinking that passes for insight in Peterson's world. But Peterson has never been one to let conceptual confusion interfere with his pontificating. He blithely equivocates between different senses of problem, eliding the distinction between a practical problem and a moral wrong. But the ambiguity allows him to slip in the loaded premise that if something bothers you, it must therefore be your moral duty to address it. This is a classic Peterson move. Smuggle in a controversial claim under cover of vagueness, then act as if it's a given. It's the intellectual equivalent of three-card Monty. But for all his philosophical pretensions, Peterson is remarkably quick to dismiss rigorous thinking when it suits him. He hand-waves away the concept of credible threats with a flippant, "What if I threaten you directly with a crime if you make the threat that's a crime? Yes, correct, right." Well, that settles that then. Who needs carefully calibrated legal standards when you have Peterson's razor-sharp intuition? Due process and the presumption of innocence are mere trifles to be brushed aside in the face of Peterson's unassailable gut feelings. This cavalier attitude towards basic legal principles is of a piece with Peterson's chilling authoritarianism. For all his posturing about defending free speech, he's remarkably eager to arrogate to himself the power to decide what constitutes acceptable discourse. His musings about prohibiting gender-affirming surgery reek of a man drunk on his own sense of moral superiority. "I don't care if you're 90, right? There's no surgeons that have the right to do that to another person," he declares, as if his personal ethical intuitions should be enshrined in law. So much for the vaunted liberalism Peterson claims to champion. But then, consistency has never been Peterson's strong suit. He's perfectly happy to contradict himself if it allows him to score a rhetorical point. One minute he's arguing for the importance of learning from your mistakes. The next he's questioning whether people with addictions have any real agency or freedom of choice. His principles shift with the winds of his argumentative needs, unmoored from any coherent philosophical foundation. Nowhere is this more apparent than in his incoherent ramblings about the relationship between freedom and virtue. He first endorses the idea that in order to be truly free in your own heart or your own mind, you have to be virtuous, but then immediately undercuts it by saying enforced virtue is not virtuous, it's obedience. So which is it? Is freedom impossible without virtue, or is coerced virtue fake virtue? Peterson wants to have it both ways, to pay lip service to freedom while smuggling in his own preferred constraints. It's a masterclass in intellectual dishonesty. But what else can we expect from a man who trades in false equivalencies and bad faith analogies? Peterson compares the progressive version of assisted suicide with a free rainbow unicorn, as if there's no meaningful difference between a highly regulated medical procedure and a magical creature. This is the level of discourse we're dealing with, cheap shots and empty mockery in place of substantive engagement. And when Peterson does try to grapple with the actual arguments for assisted suicide, he can't help but slide into self-parody. If I'm in my old age and I have some kind of difficulty and I'm not having any fun anymore, I want to be able to kill myself, he whines, as if the right to die is all about maximizing geriatric amusement. This flippant reduction of a complex ethical issue to a matter of personal enjoyment betrays a staggering shallowness of moral reasoning. But that's par for the course for Peterson, a man who never met a thorny philosophical question he couldn't flatten into a cheap applause line. This allergy to nuance reaches its apotheosis in Peterson's cartoonish caricature of the left-right divide. In his Manichaean worldview, conservatives are stuffy moralists trying to legislate virtue, while progressives are libertine hedonists who believe in too much freedom. Never mind that these broad-brush stereotypes bear little resemblance to the actual arguments made by either side. Peterson needs his simplistic dichotomies, his stark battle lines between good and evil. The messy realities of political disagreement have no place in his Manichaean morality play. But then, Peterson has never been one to let the facts get in the way of a good story. Why wrestle with the real-world complexities of homelessness and addiction when you can just assert that people living on the streets must be learning from their poor choices? Why grapple with the nuances of harm reduction and public health when you can simply declare that, if you're hooked, you don't have freedom? In Peterson's world, every social problem has a pat moralistic explanation, every human failing a tidy just-so story. This is the fundamental flaw in Peterson's worldview, his glib certainty that he has it all figured out, that his simplistic nostrums can solve the most intractable of human problems. His more responsibility argument is a case in point, a mix of crypto-Calvinist work ethic and self-help bromides that mistake sanctimony for profundity. Peterson's breezy assurance that taking personal responsibility for the world's ills will lead to a meaningful life reads like a parody of boomer bootstrap rhetoric, a hollow exhortation to individual virtue in the face of systemic failure. But what can one expect from a man who unironically invokes the symbolism of the whore of Babylon and the Scarlet State as if he stumbled upon some great Rosetta Stone of political insight? This is the intellectual equivalent of doing donuts in the parking lot, all sound and fury signifying nothing. Peterson's bloated metaphors and tortured analogies serve only to expose the emptiness behind his grandiloquence. The sad truth is that for all his pretensions to philosophical depth, Peterson is little more than an intellectual con-man, a peddler of half-baked theories and reheated self-help cliches. His vaunted neo-Jungian approach is just a highfalutin gloss on the kind of vapid motivational speaker pablum you can find in any airport bookstore. His insights are the bland platitudes of a mediocre mind, made to seem profound only by their impenetrable convolution. In the end, what is most galling about Peterson is not his lack of originality or his intellectual shoddiness, but his sheer hubris. The man truly believes he has found the secret to life's meaning, the magic key that unlocks all human potential. But scratch beneath the surface of his grandiose claims and you'll find nothing but the hollow certitudes of a secular televangelist. Peterson's prescription for a meaningful existence is little more than a warmed-over Protestant work ethic, complete with the Calvinist overtones of predestination. In his view, one finds purpose by dutifully accepting one's lot in life and toiling away at whatever problems present themselves. It's a bleak and Sisyphean vision, a world where meaning is reduced to the dutiful completion of endless arbitrary tasks. This is not the stuff of human flourishing, but of soul-crushing drudgery. But then, that's always been the secret of Peterson's appeal. His ability to dress up the drab conformity of traditional roles and hierarchies in the shiny garb of self-actualization. He tells his audiences what they want to hear, that their dissatisfactions and failures are not the product of a broken system or an unjust world, but of their own inadequate responsibility. It's a seductive message, one that promises easy answers and absolves us of the need for collective action or systemic change. But it's a false gospel, a siren song luring us onto the rocks of despair. Because in the end, no amount of personal responsibility can fix a world of entrenched inequality, environmental catastrophe, and socio-political dysfunction. These are not problems that can be solved by individual bootstrapping, no matter how much Peterson may wish it were so. The harsh truth is that we live in a world of complex systems and institutional failures, a world where the deck is stacked against the many for the benefit of the few. In such a world, The notion that one can find meaning through dutiful toil and quiet acceptance of one's place is not just naive, but actively harmful. It's a philosophy of learned helplessness, a recipe for resignation in the face of injustice. And that ultimately is the real danger of Peterson's sophistry. It's not just that he's a mediocre thinker masquerading as a profound one, or that his arguments are riddled with fallacies and contradictions. No, the real problem is that his ideas actively discourage the kind of critical thinking and collective action necessary to challenge the status quo. Under the guise of promoting personal responsibility, Peterson is really peddling a philosophy of passivity, a worldview that tells us to accept our lot and blame ourselves for our struggles. It's a message that serves the interests of the powerful, not the powerless. And in an age of rampant inequality and looming ecological collapse, it's a message we can ill afford to heed. The antidote to Peterson's sophistry is not more of the same, but a radical commitment to reason, empathy, and solidarity. We need a vision of the good life that isn't based on the hollow directives of self-help gurus, but on a clear-eyed understanding of the systemic forces that shape our lives. We need a politics that isn't afraid to challenge entrenched power, to fight for a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just survive. And most of all, we need the courage to reject the false prophets and easy answers, to strike out on the difficult but necessary path of collective struggle and social transformation. Because in the end, the meaning of life is not found in the slavish adherence to some preordained responsibility, but in the joyful, exuberant work of building a better world together. So let us take up this challenge, not with the hollow certitudes of charlatans like Peterson, but with the full force of our reason and our humanity. Let us dare to imagine a world beyond the stale dichotomies of order and chaos, a world where every human being can flourish and find meaning on their own terms. And let us work tirelessly, day in and day out, to bring that world into being.